Hello, thank you for joining. As part of the ERA and Picrogen funded project, we have prepared short presentations with the main outputs from experimental trials. Research was done by the monogastric research group, and most of the trials were conducted at AFBI pig farm in Hillsborough. For the present study or presentation, we have Dr. Samuel Ho, who is going to present the second in a series of three studies in these seminars. Please, Sam.
Thanks very much, Ramon. I'm Samuel Ho, and as Ramon said, I conducted my PhD at Hillsborough, with the main focus being on developing intervention strategies to improve the performance of low birth weight pigs. I conducted a series of studies, and the last one that was presented basically showed that there is an increasing problem of low birth weight pigs on our farms within Northern Ireland. And what we really saw with those low birth weight pigs is an increased level of pre-weaning mortality, lower weaning weights, and impaired lifetime performance. And the lactation period and the immediate post-weaning period have been identified as critical windows for intervention. So that led to the development of this second study, which was to determine the growth response of low and average birth weight pigs to sow lactation feed intake. The aims and objectives of this study were to determine the impact of an increased nutrient supply to pigs through sow lactation feed intake on the growth performance and the mortality of pigs until weaning, to analyse the effect of birth weight on sow feed allowance on suckling behaviour, and then finally to establish if achieving a high feed intake in sows during lactation had any sort of impact on the growth or the feeding behaviour of animals during the finishing period. So with that in mind, a 2x2 factorial design study which employed 448 piglets was undertaken over 8 replicates at AFBI Hillsborough. Within each replicate, there were 4 sows which were balanced for parity and body condition, and these were established as foster mothers. And within 36 hours of farrowing, 2 litters containing either 14 low birth weight piglets, all under 1 kilogram, and 2 litters of 14 containing only 14 average birth weight piglets, ranging from 1.3 to 1.7 kilograms, were randomly assigned to each of the foster mothers. Lactation feed allowance was offered at either a high level or a low level, but it's important to note here that the low lactation feed allowance was designed to replicate what is currently being fed on commercial farms in Northern Ireland. Weaning was undertaken at 28 days of age, and piglets then had their vitality, their behaviour, and their performance measured on an individual basis during lactation and throughout their lifetime. So straight into the pre-weaning performance, piglet rectal temperature was significantly higher for average birth weight pigs. And now whilst that difference was only 0.8 degrees, it was highly significant, and it illustrates the compromised vigour and vitality of low birth weight pigs immediately following birth. Average birth weight pigs also tended to be born later in the litter, and the birth weight of the animals in this study is important. Now, the birth weight shows that this study truly focused on what is a compromised pigs. In this case, the birth weight of low birth weight pigs was just over 900 grams. And why that's important is because these animals are the ones that are having the major impact on herd health and performance in the current commercial situation. There were no interactive effects in terms of the piglet performance, but as expected, average birth weight pigs performed better than low birth weight pigs in terms of their weaning weight. And weaning weights were also greater for piglets reared by sows offered a high feed allowance. So these findings could suggest an innate inferiority in compromised pigs, which then hinders their growth performance. But further analysis calculated relative growth as weaning weight minus birth weight divided by birth weight. And that shows, as seen here, that the low birth weight animals were able to express a relative growth rate 1.6 times greater than that of average birth weight pigs during lactation. So what that demonstrates is compromised pigs might not actually be biologically inferior, and that lower weaning weight could be purely a consequence of a low birth weight. Relative growth was also greater for animals reared by sows offered a high feed allowance as well. Also, as expected, low birth weight pigs recorded a greater mortality than average birth weight pigs during lactation, and that resulted in a smaller litter size at weaning. But it's worth noting here that when the low birth weight pigs were reared on sows offered a high lactation feed allowance, their pre-weaning mortality was halved, and that resulted in an increase in their litter size by 1.5 pigs on average at weaning. However, it's also very interesting to compare the individual means of each of the 4 treatment groups. And when we do that, we can see that at weaning, the low birth weight pigs reared by sows offered a high lactation feed allowance were significantly heavier than those of a low birth weight reared by sows offered a low lactation feed allowance. But more interestingly, we can see that low birth weight pigs and sows with a high lactation feed allowance were actually able to match the weaning weight of average birth weight pigs reared on sows offered a low or a commercial lactation feed allowance. And then finally, as expected, average birth weight pigs on sows offered a high feed allowance with the heaviest of all the treatment groups. So what this suggests is that firstly, feed allowance fueled a greater milk yield in the sow, which supported heavier animal weights. But secondly, it shows that when increased milk was available, both the low and the average birth weight piglets had the capacity to use it. The relative growth of these pigs during lactation shows just how much harder or how much more difficult it is for the low birth weight pigs if they're to match the performance of their average birth weight counterparts. So if we again look at those two middle columns, we can see that low birth weight pigs reared on sows offered a high feed allowance had to express a relative growth which was 1.8 times greater than that of average birth weight pigs on sows offered a low feed allowance, so almost double the relative growth just to match that weaning weight. So they have to work very, very hard. Looking now at suckling behaviour, the suckling behaviour of these piglets is key to understanding and to maximising their pre-weaning growth and development. We can see in the table that feed allowance had no impact on suckling frequency or either the total or average bout duration recorded between litters, litters at day 7 or day 14. And if anything, it was birth weight which was driving suckling behaviour at day 7. We can see here that average birth weight litters suckled for 31 minutes longer on average compared to low birth weight litters. And that can help to explain why pre-weaning mortality for low birth weight animals was higher, and also why it occurred at a lower weight than average birth weight litters. Simply, the low birth weight pigs weren't achieving a sufficient milk intake. However, if we fast forward then to look at day 21, week 3 of lactation, birth weight now has no effect on suckling behaviour, but litters reared by sows offered a high feed allowance resulted in a significantly lower suckling frequency, yet a 52% increase in their average suckling duration compared to litters reared by sows offered a low feed allowance. And that applied to both low birth weight and average birth weight litters. So the litters on sows with a high feed allowance were getting milk, and that resulted in fewer but longer suckling bouts. But those on a low feed allowance sow were actually getting less milk, so they terminated their bouts, but these piglets were still hungry, so they kept returning to the udder, resulting in that higher suckling frequency. The message here really is that birth weight drives suckling behaviour during early lactation, but as that lactation period progresses, sow resources become limiting, and the sow is increasingly reliant on feed intake for milk production. And as a result, it is the sow feed allowance which dictates the suckling behaviour in later lactation. Moving on now to look at the post-weaning performance, average birth weight pigs were significantly heavier throughout the post-weaning period, irrespective of that sow feed allowance. And that's in agreement with literature which shows differences in weight at weaning only increase further in the growing and the finishing periods. Pigs reared by sows offered a high feed allowance were heavier at week 5 and week 7, but by week 10 this weight benefit had reduced and it was no longer statistically significant. And that lack of significance remained the case for the remainder of the trial through to slaughter. To go slightly deeper here and look at the comparison between low birth weight pigs and sows offered a high feed allowance and average birth weight pigs and sows offered a low feed allowance, if you remember these two treatment categories recorded an equivalent weight at weaning in week 4. And in week 5, there's still no difference in their weight, but if we move to week 6, 7 and week 12, they're beginning to diverge. And by the time they reach slaughter age at 22 weeks, there's a 3 kilogram difference, and that is commercially significant. There's also little difference in the weight of the low birth weight pigs, regardless of sow lactation feed allowance, from 7 weeks of age through to slaughter. The greater relative growth recorded by the litters reared on sows offered a low feed allowance in the periods from week 4 to week 10 can help to explain this. It suggests that the pigs which were reared on sows offered a low feed allowance during lactation underwent a period of compensatory growth when that nutrient restriction was relieved following weaning. And relative growth was also greater for low birth weight pigs during the finishing period. And that allowed these animals to match the average daily gain of average birth weight pigs from week 12 to week 17. So if we look now at the more post-weaning performance, again, as expected, average daily gain was greater for average birth weight pigs throughout the post-weaning period. And furthermore, feed allowance during lactation did not influence post-weaning gain at any stage. But it's average daily feed intake here which tells a very interesting story. It mirrors exactly what we found in the first trial on farm. Low birth weight pigs really struggled to transition from milk to solid feeding, and that resulted in a significantly lower average daily feed intake compared to average birth weight pigs during that period from week 4 to week 10. The average daily feed intake of low birth weight pigs was actually 12% lower than for average birth weight pigs during that period. And that agrees with literature which states low birth weight pigs have a reduced digestive capacity. However, there was no difference in this average daily feed intake during the finishing stage. So low birth weight pigs did actually recover from that post-weaning growth check to match average birth weight pigs. Again, the sow lactation feed allowance had no effect on feed intake at any stage during the post-weaning period. Looking now at the feed conversion ratio or feeding efficiency, whilst neither birth weight nor feed allowance had any effect during weeks 4 to 10 on feeding efficiency, average birth weight pigs were more feed efficient than those of a low birth weight during the finishing period. And that can help to explain their heavier weights and average daily gain during the finishing period, despite these animals having a similar feed intake. And it also agrees with literature which shows low birth weight pigs have a reduced capacity for nutrient utilisation. So bringing all of this together, bringing together average daily gain, average daily feed intake and feed conversion, it's clear that the benefit of being reared by sows offered a high feed allowance was not built upon in the post-weaning period. But it could even be argued that that benefit wasn't retained, as the performance of the low birth weight pigs reared by sows offered a high lactation feed allowance was actually more akin to that of low birth weight pigs on sows offered a low feed allowance, rather than the average birth weight pigs on sows offered a low feed allowance. It suggests really that these low birth weight animals reverted back to their compromised state when the nutrient intervention was removed following weaning. Looking now at the feeding behaviour of the animals, there was no significant difference between birth weight or any of the parameters of feeding behaviour recorded during the finishing period. But that's a story in itself. It shows again that low birth weight pigs were able to match both the feed intake and the feeding behaviour of heavier counterparts in the finishing stage. Now that further confirms it's the immediate post-weaning period which should be targeted for a maximal effect in the improvement of the performance of low birth weight pigs. And if those differences in performance can be minimised during that first stage and second stage, that should be retained during the finishing period through to slaughter. A low sow lactation feed allowance didn't influence any of these behavioural traits. If we move on to the next slide, we can see that during week 17 to week 22, pigs reared on sows offered a low feed allowance during lactation recorded a significantly greater number of feeder visits per day. But during the duration of the finishing period, these same animals also recorded a lower feed intake per feed interval. The literature would suggest feeding behaviour comprising an increased number of visits with a reduced intake per visit, as we can see here, would indicate a higher level of competition. The electronic feed stations, which were employed during the finishing period of this study, allowed the feed intake and the live weight of pigs to be reported individually and on a daily basis throughout that period. Now, although these animals were slaughtered at 22 weeks of age, regardless of their weight, the data was able to be modelled to show the relationship between feed intake and live weight up to a common slaughter weight of 120 kilograms for each treatment group. So here the slope basically shows how feeding efficiency changed with live weight, and it also shows the amount of feed which was required to take each animal from a live weight of 40 kilograms to 120 kilograms. Now, taking the price for a standard finishing ration at the time of the study, which was £231 per tonne, I was able to calculate the economic cost of rearing low birth weight versus average birth weight pigs during that finishing period, and also the impact of the individual treatment groups. And what that showed was that low birth weight pigs required 4.5 kilograms of more feed to grow from a weight of 40 kilograms to 120 kilograms, but that actually only equated to an additional cost of £1 per low birth weight pig, so not a massive difference. It was interesting to note on this figure that the model and equations developed to illustrated a linear relationship between the change in feed conversion ratio with an increasing live weight, irrespective of the animal's birth weight or previous feeding regime. That differs from literature, where feed conversion ratio deterioration is actually shown to accelerate as pigs approach slaughter age. So we would have expected to see more of a curvature in this line. But enhanced genetics and improved nutritional understanding now allows these pigs to reach slaughter weight at a younger age, meaning that the animals employed in this study, they may not have actually reached the level of maturity required to observe that steep deterioration in FCR prior to slaughter. And it's also possible that this improvement in the rate of feeding efficiency deterioration is due to recent advances in genetic selection towards improved efficiency. And that's been driven by economic pressures and environmental sustainability in pig production. But it is noted that if animals had been retained on trial until all animals had achieved the slaughter weight of 120 kilograms, as would be commercial practice, more significant deterioration in FCR may have been observed. So to conclude from this study, a high sow lactation feed intake allowed low birth weight pigs to record a weaning weight equivalent to that of average birth weight pigs reared under commercial conditions, and it also halved mortality in low birth weight pigs. But the benefit of an increased feed allowance during lactation was no longer evident from 10 weeks of age, with compensatory growth occurring post-weaning. The ability of those low birth weight pigs on sows offered a high feed allowance to match the weaning weight of average birth weight pigs on sows offered a low feed allowance and match many of their performance parameters during the finishing period, yet still remain almost 3 kilograms lighter at slaughter, suggests that these low birth weight animals never fully recovered from the growth check at weaning. That equivalent feed intake and feeding behaviour of low and average birth weight pigs during the finishing period suggests that the 5% greater slaughter weight of average birth weight pigs was largely due to their greater feed intake during the nursery period, as well as a 2% superior FCR during the finishing period. But it was clear in this study that birth weight was the main driver of growth from weaning through to slaughter. And it highlighted really to me that there was further room for improvement in the performance of those low birth weight pigs. So I was happy to see that the mortality had been reduced during lactation in the low birth weight pigs through the greater derived milk yield achieved as a result of that improved sow feed intake. But I still felt that targeting the immediate post-weaning period was necessary to really maximise the growth performance of those compromised pigs from birth right through to slaughter when it was combined with a lactation feeding strategy. And that formed the basis of my third study, which I will discuss in my next seminar. So I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank the Department of Agriculture for sponsoring this research, as well as Pig Regen, and also to AFBI, to Queen's, and to the farm staff at Hillsborough for their help throughout the study. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam, for the presentation. I have a couple of questions. The first one is, especially for the pre-weaning results, that was it what is included, or did you have into account the impact of sows' body condition or back fat level?
Yes, the body condition will have a big impact on the performance of those pigs, because if the sow is able to mobilise a greater amount of back fat or of body reserves, that will be reflected in improved liver weight. So to account for that, all of the treatment groups were balanced in terms of both the sow's body condition and sow weight, and also the sow parity. All the sows employed in this study as foster mothers were of parities 2 to 4, which meant that they were at their peak in terms of milk yield. So yes, that was accounted for and shouldn't have impacted the results seen in terms of the piglet performance.
Okay, and then the second one is, you have shown feeding behavioral differences on the finishing stage, and how would you explain this treatment effect?
That is a difficult one to explain. If you recap, the difference was that the piglets reared on sows offered a low feed allowance, had a greater number of feeder visits per day during the finishing period with a reduced feed intake per feed visit. The literature would show that that type of behaviour indicates a high level of competition, but the animals in these pens were all of a similar weight, so it's really unclear where that competition could have been manifested. The only conclusion that I could draw from it was that their feeding behaviour during the finishing period is actually very similar to their suckling behaviour during lactation, where the litters on sows with a low feed allowance had a higher suckling frequency with a lower average bout duration. So very similar to what we saw in the finishing period, and it's maybe possible that that behaviour that they learnt during lactation persisted in that animal group throughout their life. But again, further work would be probably needed to confirm that idea or hypothesis.
Okay, thank you, Sam, and thank you again for the presentation, and thank you all for joining us in this seminar. Thank you.
Thank you.